In spite of all the polls and political predictions, Donald Trump won in a landslide in this year's 2024 presidential election, winning the popular votes and the electoral map. The last time a president won a second term that wasn't consecutive was in the 19th century. Trump survived two assassination attempts and court cases that carried the possibility of life in prison. While the legacy media has condemned Trump as dangerous, he has proven popular with the people. The turnout for Trump was amazing, proving that in spite of all the scandals, he has a broad base of support. This election cycle was not without surprises, with Joe Biden starting out and then Kamala Harris finishing. Patrick and I are going to talk about what this means for America, why it happened like this, the state of American politics and its future. Patrick, it's good to have this conversation now about such a relevant event. The whole world was watching.
Yeah, and you're right. We saw two assassination attempts against Trump. Nobody will forget the iconic image of Donald Trump raising his fist in the air with blood gushing out of his ear. We also saw the images of him sitting day after day in court with charges that could face life in prison. We saw him compared to Hitler by Kamala Harris. Biden said Trump supporters were garbage. The media said fascist over and over again. Still, that clearly wasn't enough to stop him. All this just made him more loved by the American people. Trump won the popular vote as well as the electoral vote. And so you can't classify Trump supporters now as just a fringe group anymore. In fact, this shows a huge demographic shift.
Unlike the United States, unlike 2016.
Yeah, because you're right. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Trump won the states. And so they said, well, this is just a relic of 300 years ago. We should change it. No, they're not going to say that anymore, you know. This shows a huge demographic shift where Trump gains with younger voters, with women and among Hispanics and blacks. Moreover, by the Republicans also taking a majority in the House and the Senate, it shows that whatever the Democrats' message was, it clearly didn't resonate with the American people. Kamala Harris said, vote for me because I'm not Trump and I'll keep everything the same. Americans, though, want change. They're like, just accept the inflation. Well, no.
Interesting. What happens now to Kamala Harris?
She's finished politically. I mean, she may survive in the Senate. Who knows? I don't even know if she's still a senator. But, she doesn't come across as authentic. There's no way she could win a primary election, in the first round. Her rise in politics was because she was selected. She used a teleprompter even in informal gatherings. It seems she doesn't have an original thought. There's no meat on the bone. A reporter asked her what her policy on taxes would be, and she replied, I grew up a middle-class kid. With Biden, it was Operation Bubble Wrap, hide in the basement. With her, it was only slightly different. And it's really remarkable and telling the way the two candidates have been cast as left and right by their opponents. And I'm not sure I agree. If Kamala Harris, for example, is so Marxist and leftist, then why did Dick Cheney campaign for her? A better way to see these things is the system versus populism, freedom versus slavery. You don't welcome Dick Cheney's endorsement like you don't welcome the endorsement of the KKK. If they endorse you, you say, so what? But she was like really glad to have Dick Cheney's endorsement, which tells you a lot about where she's coming from.
Why don't you tell us about Dick Cheney?
Yeah, he was George Bush's vice president. He also had a long history with the Reagan administration and George Bush's father, George W. Bush's vice president. He's considered the architect of the Iraq War, and his own company got the contracts to rebuild Iraq. He increased the aggrandizement of the unitary executive. That is this idea that the president acts alone without the power of Congress. And we saw this in a lot of the Bush administration's dictatorial executive orders. He's considered a neoconservative, and they argued for the Iraq War on the pages of the American newspapers. And if you ask me, my views on September 11th, I would say that he's actually criminal, way beyond what is even accepted, and that he carried out the September 11th attacks. But the new kind of populism that Trump represents has been very critical of Dick Cheney and neoconservatism.
So what sort of policies can we expect in a second Trump presidency?
I promise you it won't be boring. We got a glimpse of what it'll be like when a couple of weeks ago, RFK Jr., Robert Kennedy Jr., said to the FDA, that's the Food and Drug Administration, copy your records and pack your bags. In other words, they're coming for the corrupt officials. Another glimpse came from when J.D. Vance, Trump's vice president, stated we could fire everyone in government.
Okay, that's a lot of people, I guess.
It is. Too much people. The governments are bloated. Ultimately, it comes down to if you think they're doing more harm than good by existing. I mean, there are positions existing as mid-level and upper-level bureaucrats. There's a lot of indication by who Trump is surrounding himself by this time that a complete overhaul of the system itself is coming. How far he'll go is the question. I mean, it depends also on what kind of pushback there is. Trump dominated the news for 3 election cycles. Nobody has ever done that. It's only beginning. The media is going to have to think about coming to terms, or they're going to have to think of a better way to come to terms with what a Trump victory means. Those that characterize Trump as a stupid lunatic without any brain cells, I mean, we've all heard this, they clearly don't know what they're talking about. And unless there's an attempt to come to terms with what this victory means, the Democrats will continue to lose elections, and the media that supports the Democrats will continue to lose relevance. There are so many issues that resonated with voters, from ending the censorship to environmental issues. You don't hear about Trump's environmental battles and ecological vision because it doesn't fit in the convenient narrative the media has set out. Hemp is one example, his desire to regulate food to make America healthy again, that's another. The genius of Trump is that he's been successful in separating the Republican Party from its neocon base. Even though Reagan is still a hero, Reagan was part of this craziness. Trump's first vice president was from this crazy wing. But J.D. Vance is a bird of an entirely different color, which makes it reasonable to speak of Trumpism as now a permanent force that continues to shape the Republican Party for good. Neoconservatism is now effectively dead, or just moved over to the Democrats.
What's the neoconservatism?
Yeah, this is the name of an intellectual movement that really flowered with the George W. Bush administration. Of course, it didn't start with them. I think you can see its roots in the Reagan administration before, but it's this idea, you know, they signed this document, the Project for the American Century. It's this idea that we use American military power for regime change and a very aggressive foreign policy. They advocated things like putting missiles in space, and they argued for the end of history based on this neoconservative vision. So it's these people that were around George W. Bush, like Dick Cheney and all these people that were known as the architects for the Iraq War. Also, we mean neoconservatism to differentiate it from older forms of conservatism, as well as current forms of conservatism that focus more on limited government, states' rights.
Why was the 2020 election so controversial?
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons they say that Trump doesn't believe in democracy, because, you know, on January 6th of 2021, Trump supporters they stormed the Capitol buildings. Some people now say that the police actually let them in. But, you know, they didn't want the election to be certified because they believed Trump that it had been stolen and there had been fraud. They wanted there to be an investigation. And so they went into the Capitol and tried to prevent it from being certified. You know, in all the presidential elections, we have independent observers, neutral observers that are there to make sure that there's no funny business. Just like, you know, in Venezuela, we don't trust their elections because they don't have international observers. But in 2020, it was a completely different situation because they had their social distancing, 2 meters. And so you can't have observers observing the election if you got to maintain social distancing. And so there was concerns on a lot of fronts that the election was stolen. And so it's very controversial, and Trump continues to say that he won the election.
Talk to us about the censorship.
Oh, well, this is such a key issue, and it's interesting. I know our podcast has a large following in Latin America and the Middle East. I have to say, they have no idea about how Biden was encouraging and demanding the tech companies to censor his political opponents. Within 24 hours of Joe Biden coming into the White House in 2021, he told social media, unless you censor my political opponents, we will shut you down. I mean, that's real authoritarianism. That's real dictatorship. But because the media is silent about it, it just passes without knowledge.
Who joined Trump's team from the left?
Yeah, this is another thing that's been really distorted in the media. I mean, in the media, they've said Trump will only work with those who think just like him and who flatter him. But actually, the opposite is true. He's put together a very politically diverse team, the most politically diverse team I've seen in my lifetime. Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., these are just a few of them. And the people that have endorsed Trump from the left, the famous feminist Naomi Wolf, Joe Rogan, it could go on, Nicole Shanahan, people from Silicon Valley. You don't hear about Donald Trump's coalition of left-leaning figures because the media says once they go over to Trump, then they are right-wing. But that's a very naive way of thinking about politics. Take my case, for example. I supported Trump because I wanted transparency in government, an end to corruption. I'm pro-environment and against foreign wars. I don't like lobbyists and censorship. These positions used to be called liberal. In the US, I was called extreme left-wing and an American hater because of my work on September 11th and these truth movements. The September 11th truth movement, of course, being a subset of the anti-war movement. Trump threw him back to the States, overturning a ban that's been in place since 1937. What does crazy California do? They re-ban it. They reinstitute the ban on hemp. Through Robert Kennedy Jr., Trump has promised to end water fluoridation and set free political prisoners. What could be more radical than that? 20 years ago, I was talking about election integrity and election transparency. I was considered far left just for talking about it. Now Trump's made that center stage. And I think it's really healthy that a lot of these issues are now becoming center stage.
In the press, they say Trump only surrounds himself with yes men. You're right that he's united so much diversity. What was that story you told me about when RFK Jr. was suing Trump and Trump let him ride on his airplane?
Yeah, this is a funny story. Trump wanted to build a golf course in upstate New York, and Kennedy was working on making it a protected wetlands. And so he sued Trump to keep him from building the golf course there. And Kennedy's wife at the time needed to go to New York. And Kennedy said, well, I don't want to pay for you to go to New York. And then so she called Trump and said she wanted to go down to Florida. And Trump said, hey, you can ride in my private airplane. I'm going there. And so even though Trump was suing, Kennedy was suing Trump, they were still friends.
Did RFK Jr. work in the first Trump administration?
Yeah, he did. Donald Trump brought him in to review the health policy about vaccines. And of course, that was all kind of stopped by a variety of things, including 2020. But at least there was that intention to work with him. I don't think they got anywhere.
But if the Democrats want to win in the future, what do they have to do?
Stop being racist and sexist and classist. Stop reducing American politics to oppress versus oppressor. That's all they see. But what about the ideas? What about economics?
Can you give us some examples of this racism?
You see it all the time on CNN. You read it in all the newspapers and magazines. The New York Times, when Trump won on Wednesday, they had a sub-headline. When it was finally known that Trump won, their sub-headline was, "It's a man's world." Like that movie, Mad World. They don't mean that as a good thing. But what about Kamala Harris's policies or lack of policies? Could it be that voters rejected her not because she was a woman, but because of her ideas? Any criticism of Obama was seen as motivated by racism, just like criticism of Israel is called anti-Semitic. Yet all the time in the press, we hear Trump supporters characterized as white supremacists, Christian nationalists, pre-modern. The views the media and the Democratic Party put forward are intrinsically racist because they mandate diversity and scream for diversity, but it's not diversity of ideas. And it presupposes that all people of one group have the same thing to offer, as if that group is homogenous. So companies, for example, with equity standards have to have so many Black people, so many Asian Americans, so many lesbians, so many homosexuals, so many Black people, just like Biden insisted when he had to pick a Supreme Court justice. He insisted that it had to be a Black woman. But what about the right person for the job? It could be a Black woman, but it's exactly the opposite of this being colorblind, like Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in the Civil Rights Movement. Look, Michelle Obama got up at the Democratic National Convention this year, and she said, "I know a lot of people are upset at me because when you're a Black woman, people don't like it when you got a strong opinion." Well, it's never been proven that Michelle Obama is a woman. If you criticize Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris, then you're a sexist or racist. Barack Obama, whose real name is Barry Soetoro, and whose stepfather ran death squads for the Indonesian government under the leadership of George Bush, we don't care if Barry, we don't care if Barry's gay and married to a tranny. Americans look foremost to policy. And why don't the Dems get that? The Kamala Harris choir says ad infinitum that they're voting as women, as Black, as people of color. Is it okay to be white? I'm sure that all my white friends won't mind me saying I'm supporting Donald Trump as a white man. It's a good time now to be white. Of course, I'm saying this as tongue-in-cheek to prove a point. Jennifer Lopez got up there with Kamala Harris and said this election for her is about being a woman. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Others, like rapper Cardi B, said this election is about rights for Black people. What about universal human rights? They say Black Lives Matter, but all human rights matter. It's racist because you're only seeing race. It's sexist when you only see gender. And it's classist too, saying that Trump's status as a magnet alienates him automatically from concerns of working people. How is this diverse when all you have is class, race, and gender? It's also Marxist because it divides the country into oppressed and oppressor. Kamala Harris constantly quotes Marx. She's not very smart, but she can quote Marx, unburdened by what has been. Why would they do this? Why would they make us the divided states of America? Once you balkanize America by gender, by race, by class, by ideology, left versus right, then America won't ever come together to fix what's broken. The massive migrant invasion also supports this division because these illegal migrants, they don't have the meta-narratives of what it means to be an American with constitutional liberties and traditions and participation in the public sphere. The charge of Trump representing the rich by way of his being rich is particularly cheap shot because the fact that he's independently wealthy, he doesn't have to go to the donor class and ask for donations. And they call them campaign contributions. They're really bribes because then they want their part. So Barack Obama, he had to go to Wall Street, he had to go to the pharmaceutical industry, he had to go to the, processed food industry, he had to go to the weapons manufacturers because he didn't have his own money. He depended on that money. So actually, it's only through Trump being rich that he can be independent.
Is Kamala Harris black?
Actually, she appears to be what we call transracial.
Okay.
Everything trans these days, including transracial. She identifies as black without actually being black. And now she might have some black in her, but we found out that she actually faked her grandmother. There's been a lot of research into this. In her biography, she said, "Oh, I've got all these black family." It was just all fake, and that's all come out in the last few weeks.
What's Trump's economic vision?
Yeah, well, I was in California in 2016 when he was running for president for the first time, and I was working in a restaurant, and I got there early every day, and I walked up to the bar, and I would watch his live speeches. It was the first time I'd ever seen a politician on the national stage that gave improvised speeches that didn't depend on speech writers. It was also the first time that I saw a politician on the national stage that was talking about the problems with globalization and the problem with these free trade agreements. That had always been a taboo in American politics. And we used to have an industrial base, but our factories, we used to make hats, we used to make cars, we used to make shoes, but one by one, all those factories were sent overseas. So Trump's economic vision is a criticism of globalization.
Well, now I'm going to ask you now to be critical of Trump. Nobody knew what a Trump presidency would look like starting out in 2016. You told me personally that you were disappointed. Criticize Trump's first 4 years. As you know, it's never black and white, and Trump uses a lot of rhetoric. For me, the Muslim ban was just so bad.
Yeah, and the Muslim ban was actually ruled unconstitutional, so it shows you the president isn't all-powerful. And we've talked before on this channel about how the demonization of Muslims really goes back to George W. Bush. The things I disagree with Trump about and look back over his first 4 years, they're all similar to what Obama and Biden did. That's not why he's criticized in CNN and BBC and the New York Times. Look, Trump came in and he wanted to drain the swamp, as he said. But when you kill a snake, you cut its head off and you bury its head because it will come back and reconstitute itself. And I don't think Trump really understood the extent of the corruption. He said he wanted to run the United States as a business, but then he closed millions of businesses, during the so-called pandemic. He admits that he made mistakes and he had the wrong people around him, but he should have been more savvy going in. He got bogged down by the corruption. What the media hates is that Trump is knocking on the door to challenging the real criminal power, unelected power. The fact that Trump doesn't accept the narratives of the fake news media, I think, it just drives him crazy. Trump could go further. Remember when I said the CIA is the biggest drug cartel in the world and they drive foreign policy and cause terrorist attacks? Even if Trump doesn't know the full extent, just challenging their power, there's going to be pushback. You're going up against real power, against entrenched power. Trump wasn't running this time around. He wasn't running against the person of Kamala Harris as much as he was running against the deep state, against a system. Kamala's mother worked for the CIA as part of mind control and torture, just like Obama's mom worked for the CIA in Indonesia. So Trump needed to call out the system, and he failed to do it because as much as the drug dealing of the Bush and Clinton family is documented, it's still a secret, just like September 11th and false flag terrorism. A good example of this is RFK Jr.'s daughter-in-law, who was his campaign chairman before he dropped out and endorsed Trump. She's an ex-CIA field agent who she gave a long talk recently about how the intelligence agencies are corrupting America, but she didn't mention anything about the drug dealing. And okay, we've talked mostly about CIA drug dealing in the 80s and 90s, but how could she not know that this was going on? But, just shows you what a breakaway civilization we're living in with the high-tech narratives. The reason American politics and the two parties are the way they are now is because of George W. Bush. Criticizing the wars he started isn't enough. We have to go further. We have to come to terms with the evil of carrying out the attacks in New York. Only then will we be able to truly assess the role of the media in our lives and its intersection with private power and, government, shadow structures. That's a conversation, though, that even the strongest Trump supporters and the so-called alternative media, they don't want to have. And so their effect to make the case to the American people, although it's been successful, is still limited.
Why is Donald Trump such a polarizing figure?
In Canada, they don't question the status quo as much. England, same story. England is a lot like crazy California. They see Trump supporters as crazy wackos with guns. Europeans can't believe it. They're in shock. I think it has something to do with the gap between the policy and the rhetoric. With Trump, that gap is gone. So what I mean by that is all recent past presidents, there's been a gap between their policies and their words. They would do one thing, but they'd have a completely different rhetoric. Whereas Trump, he just states the policy and people can't handle it and they freak out. With other past presidents, people didn't even know what the policy was a lot of the time, but because they had a certain rhetoric, they, like Obama killed more people than Trump. He went to war with Libya, with Syria, with Yemen, but he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And they said when they gave him the Nobel Peace Prize, it wasn't because of Obama's actions, but because of the hope that he inspired. So Trump, because he's not coming from the political class, he just says what he's thinking. And we've never seen that before in a president. And people freak out. Trump has got the left now, the Democratic Party, so trolled. And he's gotten defending positions that make them look more like Republicans, like the endless war in Ukraine. So the more the media holds onto a single narrative about Trump, he can turn it around on them and just make them look silly. He is a master of psychology. My criticism of Trump's 4 years would be very similar to what RFK Jr. has said, criticizing him when RFK Jr. was running as an independent. But even then, at the end, RFK Jr. said, we got to support Trump or America is finished. America would be over. Our freedoms, everything, if Kamala Harris had won. Not because of her, but because of the technocrats behind her. She's just a puppet. Through RFK Jr., they'll tackle the chronic disease epidemic that's in the U.S. If Trump seals the border, kicks the bad people out, doesn't start any new wars, if he stabilizes the economy, fixes the broken election system, addresses censorship, lowers the national debt, brings back American jobs, this will have such positive outcomes and reverberations. I can't even imagine. I hope they'll go further still, working with RFK Jr. to end the overhead spraying, geoengineering. I don't know how effective they'd be able to do that, but, a total overhaul. But, I'm realistic here. Trump is an imperfect instrument. First, you have to know what's going on. But Trump does seem to be more effective than anyone so far in American politics, although even only partially. But that's why he gets elected, because he's able to meet people where they are. The really ironic thing is there have been progressive American politicians who have couched an overhaul of the system in revolutionary terms, the Bernie Sanders variety. This politics, this is a long tradition in American politics with 1960s figures like Martin Luther King Jr. They say the same as Trump about ending the interventionist foreign policy. And RFK Jr. represents this older revolutionary strain. Even in pedigree, they killed his father and uncle for this impulse. It's weird and ironic now because all the structures that kind of came up with the protested against the Vietnam War, the environmental movement, the peace movement, what we historically associate with left liberal thought. Now they've become the grannies in the church enforcing doctrine, think crazy California, Nancy Pelosi. When the rock stars of the 70s wanted to fill Central Park with 1 million people, they killed them. But Trump's still standing, so last week he packed 1 million people into Madison Square Garden. And he's achieved a rock star status, and it's just beginning.